It's a process called ratification. Now, this sounds very, very technical, but it's really fundamental. It's well and good for prime ministers and foreign ministers to sign agreements, but in the end, parliaments actually have to give them the green light for them to be put into force and to actually make a difference. So both countries, Australia and Vanuatu, are going to have to ratify this agreement through both of their parliaments. Now, in Australia, this is looking basically like a formality. It hasn't happened yet, but both the opposition and the government have said, yep, we're going to tick it off. So you can expect a committee will take a look at it. And then in about 3 months, it'll be taken to Parliament, and we expect it will go through no problem. So on the Australian side, it should be straightforward. But in Vanuatu, it's looking much more tricky because the Prime Minister, Mr. Kalsakau, who actually signed this agreement back in December last year, did so at very, very short notice and only a few weeks after he was signed into office or sworn into office. And it's now emerged that there are actually significant reservoirs of distrust towards this agreement within the political system in Vanuatu, with some opposition MPs, but also some government ministers signalling that they weren't happy, that they weren't consulted ahead of this decision, and signalling that they may well delay or perhaps even look to amend this security agreement. So this is a pretty significant development because Australia had really held this up as a significant bit of the regional architecture. It's obviously a significant part of Australia's effort to try and block China from striking similar agreements to the one that it saw in Solomon Islands. And in Vanuatu, at least, it looks like ratification could well be a complicated and drawn-out process with no certainty of success for Australia.
Yeah. So what is it, do you think, that are making some parliamentarians hesitant about this agreement?
Well, on the opposition side, there seems to be a level of distrust towards Australia. Now, I don't want to overstate it. Australia is, of course, a really deep and an important partner for Vanuatu. It's the major development partner. It's probably in some ways got much more influence in Vanuatu than any other country. But there is still this deep sense in Vanuatu politics traditionally that the country should not align itself with either side in the great sort of geopolitical contest that we see gripping the Pacific at the moment. So those sort of deep non-aligned instincts are kicking in here, at least when you talk about the opposition. So a few months ago, when the Prime Minister Mr. Kalsakau was flown to Australia on an Australian military plane to meet with Anthony Albanese, there was a little bit of a hue and cry in Port Vila with opposition MPs saying that Australia was flexing its muscles in a deliberate show of its strength and influence, accusing Mr. Kalsakau, the Prime Minister, of drawing too close to Australia and compromising that long tradition of independence in Vanuatu's foreign policy, and potentially annoying other partners, in other words, China. Now, that's the opposition. When it comes to his own side of politics or his own governing coalition, and in particular his own ministry, the main problem seems to have been that they weren't consulted. So I'm told that a number of ministers, including the foreign minister, felt like the Australian government had deliberately circumvented them to go to the Prime Minister to get his signature on the line. They thought there wasn't enough due process. And now they've taken a hard look at the agreement. They've got some real reservations about just how broad and sweeping that language is. So there's now talk that potentially Vanuatu might look to try and refashion this agreement or amend it in some way. Certainly, I don't think anyone is talking about rapidly ratifying this agreement. That's not going to happen anytime soon. I don't know exactly how this will play out or where it will land, but what does seem clear is that ratification is not going to be a straightforward or an easy process for the Australian government, and that has to put a little bit of uncertainty over this entire process.
Yes, and sort of that, as you say, rather triumphant deal that was signed. So, if they can't reach some agreement or have it amended somewhat, do you think the whole thing could be scrapped?
Look, it's difficult to say. Look, my sense at this point that the most likely outcome is that the government of Vanuatu will go back to Australia and say, look, the agreement as it stands, it needs a bit of work. It needs to be amended. It needs to be narrowed in scope, and there needs to be more given to Vanuatu. Now, Whether Australia will agree to that or not, I don't know. You'd have to say that the last thing Australia will want would be to see this fall over entirely. The Australian government, which is pretty concerned, I'm told, about the fact that these barriers to ratification are now emerging. I think the Australian government will be very keen to make sure it can salvage at least the bulk of the agreement. Ideally, they'd like it to go through as it is, but if that's impossible, they'll want to do everything possible to make sure it doesn't fall over entirely. Look, it's really difficult to see where this will land at the moment. There is enormous uncertainty over this. And of course, the thing that's fueling much of this anxiety or supercharging it is the fact that politics in Vanuatu is already intrinsically so volatile. We often see prime ministers, knifed effectively. We see no confidence motions pop up with quite a lot of regularity. There are deep and complex shifting coalitions, which can see prime ministers effectively forced, as we saw in the last parliament, to basically collapse parliament, call elections to avoid losing votes of no confidence. So all of that inherent volatility in politics in Vanuatu then feeds into these broader currents and resentments around this perception that the Prime Minister made a captain's call and that Australia took advantage of that to plunge through and sign an agreement that doesn't have broad-based political support. What happens is difficult to say. Perhaps they can salvage it. Perhaps an amended agreement goes through. Perhaps it's ditched entirely. We'll have to wait and see. But yes, this agreement, which was rightly heralded by the government in December last year as a shining example of Australian diplomacy, seems to be on pretty shaky ground right now.
Really interesting reporting, Stephen. Thanks so much.
No problem, Beverly. Thanks so much.